Let us now start a new topic of Vyakaranam, the topic of compounds, the Samasa Prakaranam. Before jumping into the Samasa Prakaranam, let's first define a broader term called Vritti, which in English can be roughly translated as integration or aggregation. The Siddhanta Kaumudi defines Vritti as Parartha Abhidhanam. Here Abhidhanam stands for Abhidhiyate Anena iti Abhidhanam. Here the affix lit has been used in the sense of karane, as we have studied the Sutram 33117, Karanadhikaranayoscha, and Parartha Abhidhanam equals Pararthasya Abhidhanam. So, Abhidhanam means that by which something is described or propounded. And what is described? It is Parartha, a different sense. Different from what? Different from the sense of the constituents. Different from the sense of the constituents which are being integrated or combined. Hence, we say that Vritti is a word form giving an aggregate sense different from the exact literal sense of its constituents. And in Sanskritam, there are 5 kinds of vritti. First one is the Kridanta vritti, which of course we have studied. The adhikara is from 3193, Kridating. As we know very well, a Kridantaha is a word form, in this case a Pratipadikam, which is created by adding a Krit affix to a verbal root. Second kind of vritti is Tadhita Ghatita vritti. This is a topic which we have not studied so far. It will be our next topic after we finish the topic of compounds. The adhikara of Tadhitaha starts from 4176. Tadhitaha, and goes down to the end of chapter 5. The reason we say Tadhita Ghatita and not Tadhitanta, because even though most of the Tadhita affixes are added at the end, sometimes they go in the middle or even in the beginning of the term to which they are prescribed. That's why we say Tadhita Ghatita, formed by using a Tadhita Pratyayaha, not necessarily at the end. This Tadhita Pratyayaha is added to a padam or sometimes directly to a pratipadikam to create a new pratipadikam, because we know from the Sutram 1 to 46, Krit Tadhita Samasascha, that when we add a Krit affix or a Tadhita affix or when we form compounds, we create a pratipadikam. Okay, the third kind of vritti is Samasa vritti, which is our present topic. The adhikara is starting from 213. Prakadarat Samasaha. It goes down to the end of the second quarter of the second chapter of the Ashtadhyayi. We are of course going to study this adhikara in detail and take many examples shortly. The fourth kind of vritti is Ekashesha vritti. This is a section of the Ashtadhyayi which runs from 1 to 64. Sarupanam Ekashesha Eka Vibhaktau, down to the end of that second quarter of the first chapter of the Ashtadhyayi. For example, Mata cha Pita cha equals Mata Pitarau or simply Pitarau. So Ekashesha vritti is when we take 2 or more terms that have the designation padam, and when only one padam remains, the others go away. That is called Ekashesha vritti. As the name implies, Ekashesha means only one remains. In this case, only one padam remains. And the last kind of vritti is Sanadyanta Dhatu vritti, which of course we have studied in great detail. The section which runs from 315 down to 3132, Sanadyanta Dhatavaha. In this case, as we know, we create a dhatu by adding these affixes san, etc., which we have already studied. Before looking at compounds in detail, let us look at this note over here, which says Savisheshananam vrittirna vrittasya va visheshana yogo na. For example, Riddhasya Rajnyaha Purushaha. Here we cannot compound Rajnyaha and Purushaha because Rajnyaha is qualified by the adjective Riddhasya. This is what is meant by Savisheshananam Vrittihi Na. So if a term is qualified by an adjective, that term cannot enter into a Vrittihi. And conversely, once we form the compound Rajnyaha Purushaha equals Raja Purushaha, we cannot bring in an adjective Riddhasya to qualify Rajnyaha. Once a term enters into a Vrittihi, we cannot then bring in an adjective to qualify that term. This is what is meant by Vrittasya va Visheshana Yogaha Na. This is from the Mahabhashyam. Okay, with that short introduction to the concept of Vrittihi, let us now go into our current topic, which is one kind of Vrittihi, and that is the Samasa Vrittihi. What exactly is a Samasaha? Samasaha is Vibhaktir Lupyate Yatra Tadarthastu Pratiyate Padanan Chaikapadyancha Samasaha Sobhidhiyate, which means a Samasaha, a compound, is said to be that in which 1. The case ending of its components is lost, but its sense remains, and 2. The terms having the designation Padam combine to form a single Padam. These are the two characteristics which define a compound. Before going on, note a small point here, which is that as per the Sutram 14104, we know that the 21 sup affixes as well as the 18 ting affixes have the designation Vibhaktihi. But when we talk about compounds, it is only the sup affixes that we are referring to by the term Vibhaktihi. Yes, there are some rare cases in the Veda where a Tingantam Padam can compound, but we will not concern ourselves with those because we are studying only the classical language. So that is why here when it says Vibhaktihi Lupyate, what we mean is that the case ending, the sup affix of the components of the compound is lost, but its sense remains. For example, Rajnyaha Purushaha, Raja Purushaha. Once the compound Pratipadikam Raja Purusha is formed, the Shashti Vibhaktihi following Rajan as well as the Prathama Vibhaktihi following Purusha is lost. We know the sutram for that. Supo dhatu pradipadikayoho 2471. When we form a compound, we create a pradipadikam, and then the sup affix inside the pradipadikam is elided by 2471. But its sense still remains, even though the Shashti Vibhakti has been elided following Rajan. Its sense is still there because we know that Raja Purushaha means Rajnyaha Purushaha, the king's man. So even though the Shashti affix is not actually present, its meaning is still present in the compound. Similarly, the Prathama Vibhakti, the first case affix Su following Purusha is elided, but its meaning is still there. The second characteristic of a compound is that terms having the designation Padam combine to form a single Padam. So here we have Rajnyaha, which has the Padasanya by Suptingantam Padam 1414, and Purushaha, which also has the Padasanya by the same Sutram, combining to first give the Pratipadikam Raja Purusha, and then following that Pratipadikam, we have to of course add the appropriate sup affix by 412, Svaujas, out, etc. Because that Pratipadikam Raja Purusha cannot be used unless and until we add the appropriate sup affix. Which sup affix we add to the compound will of course depend on the role of the compound in the sentence. For example, Raja Purusham Pashyami, I see a king's man. In this case, we have to add the affix following the Pratipadikam Raja Purusha, the compound Pratipadikam Raja Purusha. Similarly, Raja Purushasya Gruham, the home of the king's man. Here we add the sixth case affix following the Pratipadikam Rajapurusha, and so on and so forth. So the point here is that we create a Pratipadikam when we form a compound, because 1246 says Krit Dita Samasascha. Following that compound Pratipadikam, we have to bring in the appropriate sup affix by 412 before we can use that Pratipadikam. This is how we effectively create a new padam when we form a compound. In the present example, we took Rajnyaha, which has a padasanya, and Purushaha, which also has a padasanya, and combined them to create a new Pratipadikam and hence a new padam. So please remember this verse. Vibhaktir lupyate yatra tadarthastu pratiyate padanancha ekapadyancha samasaha sovidhiyate. It's very useful in helping us detect compounds. For example, the very first word of the Bhagavad Gita, dharma kshetre, we can see quite easily that the case ending following dharma as well as kshetra has been dropped, but its sense is still there. It means dharmasya kshetram. So the sixth case affix following dharma and the first case affix following kshetra has dropped, and a new Pratipadikam has been formed, dharma kshetra, and following that a seventh case affix has been introduced to get the form dharma kshetre. Hence we know that this is a compound because the case ending of its components has been lost, but its sense is still there, and terms having the designation padam have been combined to create a new Pratipadikam, hence a new padam. Okay, so this is the very basic concept of a compound which helps us detect the compounds in a sentence. And compounds are a very important part of this language. So needless to say, this is a very important topic. Compounds are also there in English and other languages. For example, we say blue collar, redhead, bluebird, non-vegetarian, blackboard, snow white, highway, so on and so forth. So compound is not something which is found only in Sanskritam. We have plenty of them in English also, which makes it easier to grasp the concept of compounds. Okay, now before actually studying the rules which prescribe compounds, let us first take a very important Paribhasha Sutram. What is a Paribhasha Sutram? A guiding rule. A rule which itself does not prescribe any operation, but which helps us in interpreting other rules. It guides us in applying other rules. The Mahabhashyam says that Paribhasha is like a lamp which, even though kept in a particular place, it lights up the entire room. Similarly, a Paribhasha Sutram lights up means it guides us in interpreting many other rules. Sutram we are taking up now is the very first Sutram in the first quarter of the second chapter of the Ashtadhyayi. Sutram is Samarthah Padavidhi. The Vritti of this Sutram says Padasambandhi yo vidhi sa samarthashrito bodhyaha, meaning an operation relating to terms having the designation padam, which of course we know is defined by the Sutram 1.4.14. Supting antam padam is to be understood to be conditioned on the terms being connected in sense. The word samartha used in the Sutram actually stands for samarthashritaha. Ashritaha means depending on, conditioned on, relying on the terms being connected in sense, which is what is meant by samarthaha, equals sambadharthaha, connected sense. For example, Rajnyaha Purushaha equals Raja Purushaha. Here the connection is obvious. When you say Rajnyaha, of the king, then obviously we say what or who of the king, and that connects us to the man, the king's man. But consider the sentence Bharya Rajnyaha Purusho Devadattasya. Here we cannot form a compound between Rajnyaha and Purushaha because they are not connected in sense. The connection is between Rajnyaha and Bharya and Devadattasya and Purushaha. So it is the king's wife and the man of Devadatta. So even though there is a Shashti Vibhakti at the end of Rajnyaha and a Prathama Vibhakti at the end of Purushaha, we cannot blindly form the compound between Rajnyaha and Purushaha because there is no connection in meaning. As per the meaning, the connection is between Rajnyaha and Bharya, the king's wife, and between Devadattasya and Purushaha, a man belonging to Devadatta. Hence, the compound Raj Purushaha is not allowed here because there is no connection in meaning between Rajnyaha and Purushaha. This is how this condition of Samarthyam has to be checked. It is kind of obvious, but sometimes we get caught up in the mechanics of compounds, and then we should not forget this fundamental idea that unless there is Samarthyam, the ability to compound, meaning the connection in sense, has to be there. Otherwise, obviously, the compounding is prohibited. So here we can form the compound between Rajnyaha and Bharya, and also compound between Devadattasya and Purushaha, but not between Rajnyaha and Purushaha. Final note here is that this Paribhasha Sutram applies only to a Padavidhi, meaning to terms having the designation of Padam, and not to a Varna Vidhi. Varna means letter. So an operation based only on letters does not come under the domain of this paribhasha. For example, Tishtatu Dadhyanaya Takram. Tishtatu Dadhi Anaya Takram means let the yogurt be where it is. Bring the buttermilk. Even though Dadhi and Anaya are not connected in sense, the Sandhi operation between Dadhi plus Anaya equals Dadhyanaya does take place because 6177 Iko Yarnachi is a Varna Vidhi and not a Padavidhi. Iko only talks about replacing a ik letter by yan letter under certain conditions. It is not talking about any padam. So whether the designation padam is there or not, Iko applies. So please keep in mind that this Paribhasha Sutram only extends to those operations which involve terms having the designation padam. If that is not the case, then this Samarthyam test does not apply.